I thought a simple power play in my showroom would be the end of an annoying customer, but instead, I accidentally triggered a lethal corporate conspiracy. Now I'm being hunted by an organization that doesn't just want me fired, they want me erased from existence. The fluorescent lights of the corporate lobby hummed with a monotonous, soul-crushing frequency. I had spent the last 3 years of my life clawing my way up from a cubicle drone to the store manager of Apex Tech. My suit was sharp, my coffee was black, and my tolerance for inefficiency was non-existent. My philosophy was simple: keep the customers moving, keep the metrics high, and keep the store looking like a sterile sanctuary of consumerism. Most days I succeeded. Today, however, my patience was hanging by a frayed thread. A man was standing in the middle of my showroom floor, looking completely out of place. He was wearing a faded, oversized hoodie, baggy jeans that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in weeks, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. He was just standing there, staring at the high-end display consoles, blocking the path of 2 wealthy regulars who were clearly agitated. He didn't look like he could afford a screen protector, let alone the latest hardware. To me, he was just an obstacle to my quarterly bonus. "Hey you," I barked, my voice echoing slightly off the polished tiles. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes. If you aren't planning on buying anything, you need to clear the floor. You're scaring off legitimate customers." He turned slowly. His face was calm, unnervingly so. He didn't look offended, which honestly irritated me more than if he'd yelled back. "I'm just observing," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "I'm interested in how the staff manages the floor traffic during peak hours." "Oh, is that right?" I let out a dry, condescending laugh. "Well, let me give you a lesson in store management then. The first rule is, don't loiter when you're clearly trespassing on someone else's potential shopping experience. You're an eyesore. Get out." He didn't move. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I think the store looks a bit disorganized, actually. The flow is restricted. A manager should be focused on customer satisfaction, not policing the appearance of people he deems beneath him." That was the spark. The audacity of this guy, wearing rags, lecturing me on how to run my store? My blood boiled. I wasn't just annoyed, I felt personally insulted. I crossed the distance between us in 3 strides. I didn't stop to think about HR policies or the inevitable social media fallout. I just saw red. "You really don't get it, do you?" I hissed, getting right into his face. "Let me help you find the exit." Before I could even register the movement, I shoved him toward the glass doors. He stumbled, but his footing was solid. He stood back up, his eyes narrowing, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in his gaze. A sharp, cold intelligence that made my stomach drop. But I was too far gone. I lashed out, my hand connecting with his cheek in a sharp, stinging slap that rang out through the silent store like a gunshot. The sound died down, leaving a ringing silence in the lobby. The few customers nearby gasped and stepped back. One of my employees dropped a stack of brochures, the paper scattering like confetti across the floor. The man stood there, his head turned to the side, his jaw tight. He stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. Then, he slowly turned his head back to face me. The mark of my hand was already blooming angry red on his skin. He didn't scream. He didn't hit me back. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a thin, matte black wallet. He opened it, slid out a small, heavy piece of metal engraved with a logo I hadn't seen in years, the founder's mark of the international conglomerate that owned our entire retail chain. "My name is Julian Vane," he said, his voice deathly quiet, piercing through the ambient noise of the store. "And I've been conducting a secret audit of our retail operations for the last 3 months. I wanted to see how my staff treated the people they thought were invisible." My knees felt like they were turning to liquid. I tried to speak, but my throat was bone dry. He pulled out a phone and tapped a few buttons, then looked me dead in the eye. "You're finished," he whispered. "And by the time the internal investigators arrive to audit this store, you're going to wish you had just walked away." Suddenly, the front glass doors swung open, not for customers, but for 2 men in sharp, charcoal-colored suits who walked in with an air of cold, calculated purpose. They weren't police, but they carried the authority of someone far more dangerous. They walked straight past me and stood behind Julian, their eyes fixed on me like I was a criminal facing an interrogation. One of them tapped his watch and looked at the clock on the wall. "We have the records, sir," one of the men said to Julian. "The discrepancies in the inventory, the unauthorized bonuses he's been paying himself, and the illegal logs on the security servers. It's all here." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. How could they know about the inventory? I had hidden those logs behind layers of encrypted files. I looked back at Julian, who was rubbing his cheek, a cold, predatory smile playing on his lips. "You didn't just slap a customer today, Marcus," he said, his voice filled with a terrifying, calm menace. "You just handed me every reason I need to ensure you never work in this industry, or any other, ever again." As he stepped toward me, one of the men in the suits reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He didn't hand it to me, he simply held it up so I could see the header. It was marked with the seal of the corporate legal department, and right at the top, it listed "Criminal Misconduct and Fraud Investigation." My vision blurred, and the store began to spin. I realized then that this wasn't just about a slap. I had been set up, and I had walked right into the trap with my eyes wide open. Just as I opened my mouth to beg for a chance to explain, the sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder with every passing second. The sound of sirens was no longer a distant warning. It was a screeching, rhythmic pulse that signaled the end of my life as I knew it. People outside were already pressing their faces against the glass, their phones raised, documenting my humiliation for the world to feast upon. I could hear the clicks of cameras and the muffled chatter of the growing crowd. Inside, the store felt like an oven. The air conditioning seemed to have cut out, or perhaps it was just the heat of my own panic radiating off my skin. Julian Vane remained unmoved by the chaos. He tucked his wallet away with the same methodical grace he'd used to destroy my reputation in 10 seconds flat. He signaled the two men in charcoal suits, who stepped forward and flanked me like guards escorting a condemned man to the gallows. "You think this is about the slap?" Julian asked, his voice cutting through the noise of the sirens. He took a slow, leisurely step closer, the red mark on his face serving as a silent, burning testament to my ruined future. "That was just the tipping point, Marcus. You've been running this store like a private kingdom. You've been skimming from the shipment manifests for 18 months. You thought the inventory gaps were buried deep enough? You were wrong. Every digital footprint you left behind was tracked by our internal monitoring system from the moment you authorized your first fraudulent transaction." I tried to back away, but my heel caught the edge of a display stand. I stumbled, clutching at the air, and for a second, I looked at my employees. They weren't looking at me with pity or camaraderie. They were looking at me with the cold, detached relief of people who had spent months living in the shadow of a tyrant. They had known. They had seen the cracks in my armor, and they had been waiting for the CEO to come and shatter them completely. "I can explain," I stammered, my voice sounding pathetic, thin and small in the expansive lobby. I needed to manage the overhead. I did it for the store's margins. Everyone does it." Julian let out a sharp, joyless chuckle that chilled the marrow of my bones. "You're talking about an organized scheme now, Marcus. Don't dig the hole deeper. It's not just a breach of company policy anymore. It's grand larceny." The front doors burst open, and 3 uniformed officers strode in, their expressions grim. Behind them followed a woman in a sharp blazer, the regional director, a woman I had spent months trying to impress. She looked at me not with the camaraderie of a colleague, but with the utter revulsion one might reserve for a poisonous insect. "Mr. Vane," she said, nodding respectfully to Julian, completely ignoring my frantic gaze. "The server logs have been secured. The evidence matches the report provided by the internal security team. We've found the hidden accounts." "Good," Julian replied, his eyes never leaving mine. "Process the arrest. I want every single document filed before the close of business. And make sure he knows exactly what he's being charged with." One of the officers stepped forward, pulling a set of cold, heavy metal restraints from his belt. The sound of the latch clicking into place around my wrists was the final nail in my coffin. I was being paraded through the store, the very same floor I had spent years guarding with a fist of iron, now being dragged away by the people I had tried to bully into submission. As they shoved me toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of my office through the glass partition. My desk was already being rummaged through by the corporate team. My files, my computer, my personal effects, everything was being packed into cardboard boxes with cold, mechanical efficiency. I was pushed out into the sunlight, the glare blinding after the artificial lighting of the showroom. A crowd had formed, and as I was shoved into the back of the patrol car, a barrage of questions hit me like physical blows. But through the ringing in my ears, one voice stood out. It was a man I recognized, a former employee I had fired 6 months ago for incompetence. He stood near the barrier, his phone held high, his expression twisted into a triumphant, ugly grin. "Hey, Marcus!" he shouted over the noise. "How does it feel to be on the other side of the glass?" I stared at him, my throat constricting. I was being loaded into a vehicle that was going to take me to a place where my title, my suit, and my arrogance meant absolutely nothing. I was no longer the store manager. I was just a case number. Just as the officer prepared to slam the car door shut, Julian Vane leaned down, placing his hand on the frame of the window. He looked inside, his face inches from mine. The ambient noise of the crowd suddenly faded into a dull roar. "You think the police are your biggest problem, don't you?" he whispered, his eyes dark and unreadable. "But you've been working with a group of people who don't like loose ends. People who are going to be very interested in what you decide to tell the investigators." My blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" I gasped. Julian pulled a small, plain business card from his pocket and slid it through the crack of the window. On it was a single, handwritten string of numbers. "You've been moving money for the wrong people, Marcus. My security team found those transfers too. And believe me, the authorities are the least of your worries. The people you were laundering money for? They've already realized you've been compromised." He tapped the roof of the car twice, a signal for the officer to drive. As the car lurched forward, I saw a black sedan idling across the street, its windows tinted so dark that the world looked like a void. The car began to pull out, turning its wheels to follow us, keeping a perfect, haunting distance behind the patrol vehicle. I looked back at the card in my hand, my fingers trembling, as I realized the true nightmare was only just beginning. The door to my cell wouldn't be the only thing locking tonight. Someone was hunting me, and they were closer than I ever imagined. The cruiser accelerated, the tires screeching against the asphalt as we merged into the heavy city traffic. I looked back, my chest heaving with a suffocating mix of terror and disbelief. The black sedan remained glued to our bumper, a predator stalking its prey through the maze of gridlocked streets. Every time our driver tapped the brakes, the sedan mirrored the move with mechanical precision. I was caught in a vice, the law in front of me and a shadow of my own making trailing behind. "Officer, please," I rasped, leaning forward against the metal partition. "You have to listen to me. There's a car behind us. They're following us. I think they're dangerous." The officer in the driver's seat didn't even glance into the rearview mirror. "Save it for the interrogation room, pal. You've got a long night ahead of you, and trust me, your conspiracy theories aren't going to lower your bail." "It's not a theory!" I screamed, the sound echoing off the steel cage. "Check the plates! Look at the sedan!" He flicked his eyes to the mirror for a fraction of a second, then back to the road. "I don't see anything but traffic. Keep your mouth shut." My pulse was a frantic hammer in my skull. I looked down at the business card again. The numbers weren't a phone number. They were a sequence of ledger codes, the exact codes used to disguise the influx of packets with substance that had been funneled through our store's supply chain. I had thought those packets were high-end electronics. I was an idiot. I had been a glorified mule for a network of criminals who operated in the dark corners of the city, and I had been far too arrogant to ask what was inside the shipments. Now, the people who owned that network didn't care that I was a pawn. They cared that I was a liability. The sedan behind us suddenly surged forward, weaving through the lanes with a reckless disregard for the law. It pulled up alongside the patrol car, the tinted passenger window rolling down just a few inches. I didn't see a face, just the glint of a dark barrel protruding for a heartbeat before the sedan swerved violently, clipping a delivery truck and forcing it into our lane. Our patrol car slammed on the brakes, the tires wailing as we fishtailed across the wet pavement. My head cracked against the metal grating, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of sparks and pain. The cruiser spun, skidding across the median and crashing into a concrete light pole with a bone-jarring thud. The engine hissed, white steam billowing into the cabin, obscuring everything in a ghostly fog. "Officer!" I shouted, coughing as the smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the air. There was no response. The officer in the front seat was slumped over the wheel, his head resting at an unnatural angle. The silence that followed the crash was deafening. I scrambled to free my hands, the metal cuffs biting deep into my wrists. I wasn't going to wait to be finished off in the back of this wreck. I kicked at the door until the frame groaned, then swung my bound hands, slamming them against the glass again and again. It finally shattered, the shards falling away like diamonds. I tumbled out onto the asphalt, my lungs burning, my vision swimming. I didn't look back at the officers. I scrambled toward the alleyway bordering the intersection, my footsteps uneven, my heart dictating a pace I could barely sustain. The black sedan had stopped a few yards away, its doors swinging open in unison. 4 men stepped out, dressed in tactical gear, their movements efficient and devoid of hesitation. They weren't police. They weren't even hired muscle. They were cleaners. I sprinted into the darkness of the alley, the echoes of my own ragged breathing sounding like thunder in the confined space. I reached the end of the alley, finding myself trapped against a high brick wall that led to a construction site. I frantically looked for a way over, my fingers digging into the mortar, when I heard the distinct metallic click of a heavy firearm being readied behind me. "You've been a very difficult man to track, Mr. Miller," a voice echoed from the shadows. I spun around, my back hitting the cold, unforgiving brick. A man stood at the mouth of the alley, his face obscured by the flickering light of a nearby neon sign. He held a device in his hand, not a weapon, but a small, glowing tablet displaying a map of the city. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a terrifying, hollow indifference. "You took something that didn't belong to you," the man said, taking a step toward me. "Not the money, not the inventory. You took the ledger, the one you thought you'd burned. We know you have a copy on an encrypted drive hidden somewhere in that apartment of yours." My brain stalled. A ledger? I didn't have a ledger. Wait, the secondary drive I'd kept as leverage in case the corporate audit went south. The one I had hidden in the ventilation shaft behind my television. "I don't have it," I lied, my voice cracking. The man sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. He gestured to the men behind him, and they stepped into the dim light surrounding me. "We'll find it, but you won't be around to see it." As he raised his hand to signal the end of my life, a sudden, piercing screech of tires echoed from the street. A bright spotlight flooded the alley, pinning us all in a blinding glare. A voice, booming, familiar, and utterly unexpected, thundered through the alleyway. "Drop the weapons! Federal intervention! Hands where I can see them!" I squinted into the light, my heart stopping. It was Julian Vane, standing on the hood of a sleek, armored vehicle, holding a megaphone, flanked by a squad of armored tactical agents who looked like they were part of some secret internal government department. He looked at me, then at the men closing in on me, and his expression shifted from the calm executive to something far more dangerous. "You're all under arrest," Julian shouted, his voice dripping with authority. "And as for you, Marcus..." He stepped down from the vehicle, walking toward me as the tactical team engaged the gunman in a sudden, brutal flurry of non-lethal suppression rounds. "You're coming with us. We need to talk about the real reason why you were laundering those packages, and believe me, you're going to be much more cooperative once you find out who's actually been pulling your strings." He reached me, pinning me against the wall with his forearm, his eyes glowing with an intensity I hadn't seen before. Because the people you were working for? They don't just want you dead. They want to burn this entire city down to keep their secrets. And you're the only one who knows the location of the master key. The ground beneath us suddenly shuddered. A distant explosion ripped through the skyline, followed by the sound of sirens erupting in every direction. The city was under attack, and I was holding the catalyst in my pocket. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of chaos. While the tactical team clashed with the men in the alley, the distant roar of the explosion signaled that the perimeter of the district was being compromised. Julian Vane didn't flinch. He grabbed my collar, pulling me toward the armored vehicle as if I were a bag of groceries. "Get in," he commanded, tossing me into the back of the transport. The interior was a cavern of dark leather and glowing monitors, filled with personnel wearing headsets and tactical vests emblazoned with a sigil I had never seen, a stylized compass overlaid with a gear. This wasn't corporate security. This was something deep state. As the vehicle roared to life, peeling out of the alley while gunfire erupted behind us, I scrambled to the window. I saw the black sedan engulfed in a plume of smoke, but the men who had been chasing me were already retreating into the shadows of the construction site, their objective clearly shifting from my capture to something larger. "What is happening?" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the hum of the vehicle's high-tech engines. "What do you mean, burn the city down?" Julian sat across from me, his composure chillingly restored. He tapped a glass screen, and a 3D map of the city materialized in the center of the cabin. Red nodes began to blink across the grid, each one representing a hub in the logistical network I had managed. "You were never just a store manager, Marcus," Julian said, watching the nodes with cold detachment. "You were the anchor for a global supply chain designed to move illicit material under the guise of legitimate retail. The packages you moved, the ones you thought were just electronics, contained high-frequency components for a grid-disruptive system. And now that the internal investigation has been compromised, the people you served are activating the kill switch." My stomach turned. "I didn't know. I swear, I thought it was just minor tax evasion and inventory skimming. I was greedy, not a mastermind." "Your greed was the camouflage they needed," he countered. "But you kept a copy of the ledger, didn't you? The encrypted drive in your apartment. That drive contains the digital keys to deactivate their relay stations." Before I could answer, the vehicle shuddered violently. An alert blared from the dashboard. The driver shouted something about an EMP burst, and suddenly, the internal lights flickered and died. The screens went black. We were plunged into a terrifying artificial night. "They're not just hunting for the drive," Julian whispered, his voice dangerously close to my ear in the darkness. "They're hunting for the person who carries the authorization codes. You have those codes in your biometric profile, Marcus. You weren't a choice for this role. You were engineered for it." A metallic thud echoed against the hull of the vehicle. We were being boarded. I heard the hiss of a cutting torch against the rear door. My breath hitched. Julian fumbled in the dark, and I felt the cold, hard weight of a firearm pressed into my hand. "They're going to breach in 10 seconds, he said. "You have two choices. You can let them take you, and they will extract the information from your brain until there is nothing left of you, or you can use this to get us out." "I don't know how to use a weapon," I hissed, terrified. "Then you'd better learn in the next 5 seconds. The rear door blew inward with a deafening roar, the force of the blast sending me sprawling into the cabin floor. Sunlight, or perhaps the glow of burning wreckage, poured in, silhouetting a figure standing at the breach. He was massive, clad in tactical gear, holding a piece of illegal weaponry that hummed with a sickly green light. He didn't speak. He just stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cabin for me. Julian rolled to the side, drawing his own weapon, but the intruder moved with unnatural speed, knocking him aside with a single, brutal strike. The man turned his attention to me, his heavy boots crunching on the shattered glass of the monitors. "The drive, Marcus," the man rumbled, his voice distorted by a modulator. "And then, the purge." I pressed my back against the wall of the vehicle, the weight of the firearm feeling like a leaden anchor in my shaking hand. I realized then that my life had been a series of lies, but this final, desperate confrontation was the only truth left. As the intruder reached for me, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from the ceiling of the vehicle. The entire interior was flooded with a strobe-like intensity. The intruder stumbled, reeling back in confusion. I didn't think. I squeezed the trigger. The sound was thunderous, vibrating through my very bones. The force of the discharge sent me slamming back into the hull. The intruder fell, but he didn't die. He stood back up, his visor shattered, revealing a face that wasn't human. It was a synthetic mesh of wires and flesh, a cold, robotic mockery of a man. He lunged at me again, his hand grabbing my throat with a grip of steel. As the world began to fade into a blur of gray, I noticed something pinned to his tactical vest. My own security ID card, the one I had lost months ago. He leaned in, his voice a distorted, grinding, metallic rasp. "The manager is dead, Marcus. We're just here to wipe the files." Behind him, the entire vehicle was suddenly hoisted into the air by an unseen force, a heavy-duty crane lifting us right off the road. We were being suspended over the harbor, the water churning hundreds of feet below us. The man tightened his grip on my neck, and with his other hand, he reached for a small black vial at his belt, a chemical compound that I knew, with sickening certainty, was intended to scrub my memory clean. He held the vial to my face. "Let's see what's left of you when the reboot is finished." He uncorked it, the fumes curling into the air, and as the liquid began to drip toward my lips, I saw Julian Vane standing in the corner of the wreck, watching me with an expression of cold, calculated observation. He wasn't helping, he was waiting. And then, he smiled. The pungent smell of the chemical compound burned my nostrils, a sharp, metallic sting that threatened to dissolve my consciousness. I looked at Julian, the man who had orchestrated this entire audit from the shadows, and in his eyes, I saw no salvation. He wasn't there to save me. He was there to witness the extraction. My realization was swift and agonizing. I was the final component of a failed system, and they were here to harvest the data embedded in my very memories. With a surge of primal adrenaline, I didn't reach for the firearm. Instead, I jammed my fingers into the synthetic mesh of the creature's exposed throat. The wires sparked, a cascade of blue electricity arcing across the cabin, snapping the machine man's concentration. He shrieked, a sound like grinding gears, and his grip on my neck loosened just enough for me to kick him backward. The vehicle, still dangling from the crane, swung wildly over the harbor. I lunged for the manual release of the rear door, my fingers raw and bleeding as I grappled with the lever. The synthetic intruder regained his footing, his eyes glowing with a malevolent, pulsating light. He lunged again, but I was already moving. I pulled the lever, and the heavy door sheared off its hinges, plummeting into the dark, churning water below. I turned back to Julian, who was finally pulling a sidearm. "You're not going to be the one to finish this, Julian," I spat, my voice raw. I didn't fire at him. I fired at the heavy-duty hydraulic chains of the crane hook that held our cage in the air. The bullets sparked against the steel, but one found the locking mechanism. With a screech of tortured metal, the chain snapped. The vehicle fell. For 3 seconds, time suspended. The wind howled against my face, and the city lights blurred into streaks of neon. I saw Julian's face, the mask of the untouchable CEO finally cracking into genuine, unadulterated fear, before he vanished into the shadows of the falling wreckage. We hit the water with the force of a falling mountain. The impact was a dull, thundering boom that shattered the windows and flooded the cabin instantly. The cold was instantaneous, a numbing, glacial bite that pulled the breath from my lungs. I was tossed about like a rag doll, but the sheer weight of the armored vehicle dragging us down gave me a singular goal: swim. I kicked through the wreckage, the darkness of the harbor pressing in on me from every side. Above, the surface was a distant, shimmering veil of light. I swam until my muscles were screams, until the salt water burned my eyes, and until I finally breached the surface, gasping for the freezing night air. I washed up on the rocky shoreline of the industrial district hours later, a broken, shivering shell of the man who had walked into Apex Tech that morning. My clothes were shredded, my skin was bruised, and I had absolutely nothing left. No job, no apartment, and no identity. But as I pulled myself onto the concrete, I felt something hard in the inner lining of my jacket. I fumbled, ripping the fabric open. It was the drive, the master ledger. In the chaos of the fall, my hand had instinctively clutched the secret I had been forced to carry. I stood up, watching the sunrise paint the city in hues of violet and gray. The sirens had died down, replaced by the eerie, quiet hum of a city that had narrowly avoided a total blackout. I knew the truth now. Julian Vane and his organization were a cancer, and they had just lost their only copy of the cure. I didn't head to the police. I didn't go to the authorities. I went to the one place that still had a reputation for truth, the local headquarters of the biggest, most aggressive investigative journalism outlet in the country. I walked through those lobby doors, battered and bruised, and placed the drive on the front desk. "I have the internal records of Apex Tech," I said to the confused receptionist, my voice steady for the first time in years. "And the names of everyone pulling the strings." The fallout was nuclear. Within 48 hours, the organized scheme was dismantled by a federal sweep that left no stone unturned. Julian Vane vanished from the public eye, his empire collapsing like a house of cards under the weight of the evidence I had provided. There were no more threats, no more shadows, and no more audits. I never went back to the corporate world. I traded my tailored suits for workwear, my empty ambition for a quiet, simple life in a town where no one knew my face or my name. Every now and then, I see the logo of a major tech brand and a cold shiver runs down my spine. But then I remember the sound of the chain snapping, the fall into the darkness, and the silence that followed. I am no longer the manager. I am the man who walked away from the fire. And as I watch the sunset from my porch, I know that for the first time in my life, I am the only one who owns my future. The game is over, and I am the one who gets to write the final chapter.